We have the honor this noontime of awarding the Superintendent Leadership Award from the National Coalition for Community Schools. This award is created for the superintendent who has championed the community school strategy and led their district in the alignment and in the support of community schools. This award today will be co-presented with our partner from the AASA, the American Association of School Administrators, and my partner here from the coalition, Brian Jaffe.
Thank you. I'm Brian Jaffe with AASA, the American Association of School Administrators. We are a national association of school leaders. We work to support and develop and advocate for superintendents in their work. We work with superintendents to assist them in implementing strategies and solutions that improve achievement for students, great strategies like community schools, for example. We are especially proudest of our superintendents that are leading for transformational change, that are on the vanguard of school leadership, and that are really working for social justice, and we have one such awardee today. This year's 2014 Superintendent Leadership Award goes to Dr. Ramona Bishop of the Vallejo City Unified School District in California. Dr. Bishop was chosen to lead Vallejo City in April 2011. The district was in state receivership, and the graduation rate hovered around 50%. Dr. Bishop laid out a vision for a full-service community school district focusing on the whole child and, to keep in concert with the rest of this forum so far, on each and every child. She led the district in the development of an aggressive set of goals with a focus on social justice, student engagement, and support for all students, but particularly those students who our systems have historically underserved. Dr. Bishop is moving with urgency to transform her district and in turn change lives. This coming school year, all Vallejo City Unified Schools will be community schools, and we're so pleased to honor her today.
Thank you. This is so exciting. Brian and Lisa, thank you so much. Thank you to the National Coalition of Community Schools, and thank you certainly to AASA for all of their support of our work as superintendents. I would like for you to give it up for my team, Dr. Elena Shackelford, Bel Reyes, and Kendra Montgomery Block, who are there in the audience. Can you stand, ladies? I always say, for the superintendents in the room, the thing that you can do is hire smart people. That's what your job is. And these smart people we started with 5 community schools 2 years ago. We added 10 this year. And next year, all 23 of our schools will be full-service community schools. I say to our team that our job is to eliminate generational poverty and eradicate low expectations institutionally. That's our job. And so I am very excited about this award. I look forward to continuing to partner with the National Coalition. I will do anything for any of you, so know that should you call, email, we will respond, because at the end of the day, it's our connectedness, our safety net that will lead our young people into bright futures. Isn't that right? Here's the last thing I'll say. I believe in public education. I believe in public education, and I believe in the ability of all of us to educate not the children that come with 2-parent households, not the children of wealth, not the children who speak English only, but every child in our nation. I thank each and every one of you for your time and attention, and I know that together we're going to eradicate poverty, aren't we? Thank you so much.
That's truth. That's just straight up truth. Bless you. So the next award is near and dear to the hearts of many of us who knew and loved Joy Dreyfus. How many of you knew Joy? How many of you knew Joy Dreyfus? Yes. Some of us refer to Joy as the godmother of community schools, of the modern-day community schools movement. She was a fierce warrior in her writings around school health issues and creating ways to forge new partnerships when the nation wasn't talking about it. She did research that spanned across many states, Florida in the East and the West, and she was a stickler for demanding that we have a directory of community schools so people could do site visits. And you know, if she were here today, and something tells me that she still is, if she were here today, she would just be smiling. And she would say in her wry way, "It's about damn time." Wouldn't she? Irish, she would have said that. Yes, she would have. So this award, named after Joy Dreyfus, a tireless advocate for community schools, goes to an individual who's made significant contributions to the growth of the entire field of community schools. Jane Quinn, Children's Aid Society Vice President for Community Schools and Director of the National Center for Community Schools, is this year's choice. Jane has been a vocal leader. Okay, let me finish. I got to get through this because I'm going to cry. Come on up, let me hold you while I say this. Jane has been a vocal leader for community schools. Under Jane's leadership, the National Center for Community Schools at the Children's Aid Society became a vital national organization dedicated to enhancing the capacity of community schools in local communities. Many local initiatives have the footprints of Jane and the Children's Aid Society, not only on their planning, but in their development and implementation. I can honestly say that without Jane, we would not have written the same script for community schools. And beyond that, I have to say that as a dear friend, a mentor, and someone close to my heart, it gives me no greater honor, no greater pleasure than to present this award.
Thanks, Lisa. Whoops, oh, sorry. Wow, beautiful, thank you, thank you. Thanks so much.
You want me to hold this for you?
I think that would be great, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Can you imagine how I feel? Nothing in the world could please me more than to receive an award named after my mentor and role model, Joy Dreyfus. I think many of us call Joy the godmother of this field, and she really was that, and of course, so much more. I don't know how many of you heard Joy when she would introduce herself. She would say, "I'm an activist masquerading as a researcher." And that was the truth. That really was the truth. And I understood it then, but I understand it even more deeply now. That Joy understood that the reason to do this work was social justice. That the reason to do this work was equity. She knew that back in 1994 when she wrote the book that influenced so much of our practice, the book called Full Service Schools. So it's very fitting that at this conference where we're discussing community schools as the engine for equity, that we're talking about Joy, and I know she is smiling on us. I want to say that I'm here standing on a lot of shoulders. Certainly Joy's shoulders, but also the shoulders of all of you, many people that I have learned from over the years. And particularly, I want to say I'm standing on the shoulders of the leaders of the Children's Aid Society and the practitioners at the Children's Aid Society who were doing this work 22 years ago, long before I had the privilege of joining the staff. And I'm standing on the shoulders of all the people at the National Center for Community Schools who have been doing this work much longer than the 14 years that I have been privileged to lead that organization. So it is with great humility and gratitude that I accept this award in Joy's memory, and on behalf of a very strong team of colleagues at the Children's Aid Society, past and present, local and national, and I want them all to stand up and join me. Thank you. Thank you to the Coalition for this wonderful, beautiful award. Thanks a lot to all of you. This is the dream team of leadership across the United States, the champions of community schools in communities across the country. On this panel, we have the head of a foundation, we have a state senator, we have a mayor, we have an official from one of the country's finest universities, and we have someone who is working in the White House very close to President Obama. So this is really a dream team of champions for community schools, and I'm going to introduce them in that order. This is Kent McGuire. We were realizing today that we've known each other since the early 1990s, and Kent is currently the president of the Southern Education Foundation, which I promised him last night over a glass of wine that I would let you know this is an operating foundation, not primarily a grant-making foundation.
Thank you.
Just a good thing to know. If you want to get funding, he's not the guy. If you want to get a wonderful report on children in America, we're going to be talking about that. This is State Senator Carol Liu from California, who many of us know because she led the bus tour of fellow state legislators, taking them all over the state to look at community schools last October, and we'll be hearing a little bit more about that. Next to her is a colleague and friend of mine, Mayor Pedro Segarra, the mayor of Hartford, Connecticut. Where are you out there? Okay, great. Your peeps are here to cheer you on. Mayor Segarra, I have worked with him very closely and know him to be a true champion of community schools. A man who needs no introduction in this crowd is Dr. Ira Harkavy from the University of Pennsylvania, who is head of the Netter Center at the University of Pennsylvania and former chair of the coalition. And David Johns is all the way down at the end, and also a friend of community schools, a veteran educator, graduate of Columbia University and Teachers College, and is now working in the White House and really working on the whole issue of African American male achievement and probably some other issues as well. So we had a conference call last week. We thought about what we wanted to talk about, and really we're going to talk about two big sets of ideas. The first set of ideas has to do with why the panelists, as leaders in various sectors of work across the country, are supporting community schools, why they believe. This panel is called The Challenges of Educating Today, Community Schools as an Answer. I would like to edit that. You all know my husband's a writer, so I'm going to edit that to say community schools as the answer. Can I get an amen? Can I get an amen? Amen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we're going to talk about why community schools are the answer and from the different perspectives of our panelists. Then we're going to talk about messaging. This has been a theme throughout the conference, and we're going to hear from these leaders about their advice for us on what are the messages about the various aspects of this comprehensive strategy that resonate for the audiences that they know best. So we agreed that we were going to start with Kent because Kent's organization, the Southern Education Foundation, just issued a very, very important report on children in poverty, with a focus on children in the South, but really with some important national data. So we've asked Kent to tell us a little bit about that report, and he's going to show us one slide that I think is going to set the stage for everybody else. And you all might have to turn around to see this slide, but here we go.
Jane, thank you. You know, what you'll see in this slide is probably of no surprise to people in this room. But I have been surprised about how surprising the slide has been in other places where I have put it up. You know, what it clearly indicates is that the new normal in our country is one in which a majority, or nearly a majority, of the kids in our public schools are, in the first place, kids of color. Unfortunately, a majority of them are also low-income students in California, across the South, and as you move up the East Coast. This is a free and reduced lunch, not even the best measure, but the one that we have and often use, kind of reveals that we have a very different challenge in our schools today than we had 50 or 60 years ago. And the unfortunate gaps in income that the economists are, I'm a little loud, aren't I?
Just giving you water.
Oh,
Just
oh.
water.
What's your whistle?
All right. Well, it'll slow me down. I won't talk so much. The unfortunate gaps we see in income is evident in the composition of the enrollment in the schools today. That's what's changed, way more than the schools themselves had. There are just 3 points I want to make. Jane, they may go more to narrative and messaging, but I think are important that I take away from this slide, given this forum. The first one is this. As the composition of the enrollment has changed, so too has the nature of public investment in the schools. We looked very specifically at the changing demographics of the student population and compared that to increases in spending for public education. And it's disquieting to see that the rate of increase in spending has declined precipitously, just as the nature of the student population has changed. I think in California, this is not a new story.
No.
And I'll be interested to hear where you are on that. But that's the first point. And I don't think it can be attributed exclusively to the fiscal crisis in 2008. It started before that,
Yes.
for starters. And even as state economies are now improving, we're yet to see a corresponding turn in terms of spending going up. Second point, the dominant narrative on public education in this country, I don't think, has so much emphasized community. If anything, the thrust of our popular narrative has been focused on individual or private returns to schooling and the need to expand offerings in an education marketplace, if you will, right? And third point, accordingly, the prevailing conceptions of accountability turn largely on academic outcomes in core content areas. That's fine. And the standardized measures the assessments that measure those things. But the very things we might want to know in order to better interpret those outcomes or to come up with strategies to improve them are the things that are currently de-emphasized. Social services, housing, public health, a whole series of metrics, it seems to me we would want to know more about, want to take note of in how we fund schools and the like, if we were really interested in the issues in community. So finally, I think the dominant narrative also privileges managerial solutions over democratic ones. Now, this is tricky because on the one hand, there's a legitimate critique of public education, bureaucratic, inefficient, and all of that. One in which mayors have stepped in, I think, to help with that. But at the same time, this question of where's the community's voice? How do they access this debate? And how do we know that the schools we want are the schools that people in community aspire to? I hope that's something we get to talk about.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we did talk a little bit about it last night. We heard from Eva Bolton, who's the president of the school board here, and she said she wanted to make sure that the public had the leading voice in public schools, and I think that is something we know we're sorely missing. I saw Ira giving you an amen when you started talking about the democratic part of the process, and we're going to get to you in a minute. But I do want to stay on the poverty data for a moment and ask Senator Liu, since you started handing the ball over to her, to talk about how this report and how these data resonate for you as a leader in the state of California.
It is, this information is, am I on? Yeah, this information is really devastating. California, we have about 6 million young people in our public school system. 1 out of 5 lives in poverty, 1 out of 5. 1 out of 3 come from Black or brown households. This is a tremendous challenge for us in California. We have other things going on in terms of financing. We have, I talked to Kent earlier, we are not moving away from it. We were under a court order, Serrano Priest, for a very long time to make sure that we had equal distribution of monies going to every one of our kids. This last year, the governor proposed something similar, but yet not similar. Every kid in elementary school gets the same amount of dollars. Every kid in middle school gets a different amount of dollars, and high school gets a different amount of dollars. And then if you have low income, English learners, or foster care kids, schools get an extra bonus to able to address the needs of those students. Along with this, what we call local control funding, every school district needs to come up with a plan of how you're going to address the needs of your student population. This demands community involvement and parent participation, something that has been missing at the table because we have today a lot of organized parent groups, parent voices, et cetera, coming to school boards, et cetera, demanding a seat at the table. So this sort of legitimizes that need to have more voices in determining the well-being of the students in California. More interesting thing that the LCAP money, the LCFF money is rolling out this year, but the LCAP, the plan, is not due till next year. You know, bureaucracies. So it'll be interesting to see how these things work. And the LCFF is rolling out over a period of 8 years. We take a long time in California. But it's also coexisting with something else we did in California last year, I think it was last year. We passed a proposition that gave schools an extra boost in resources. But that ends in 7 more years. So all of this is coming together, all this change, plus Common Core. So we have the money change, we have curriculum changes, we have a new burst of energy in terms of parental community involvement in school district plans or school plans. And we have a very supportive governor who wants to see success, and we have a pretty supportive legislature that is on board and is supporting the governor in these efforts. So we don't have answers yet, but at least we are making that attempt. And Jen, you referred to something that I did personally in my role as a state senator. I've been very concerned over my tenure in the legislature to see this discrepancy of wealth. And so I created a program out of my office called Pathways. And the bus tour that you referred to, actually I did a bus tour the prior year to look at food insecurity as a way to determine poverty in our states. And so we did a bus tour looking at food banks and various social service agencies dealing with what kinds of folks, what are their needs, how are you addressing the problem? And actually, being a legislator, we can't individually solve all these problems, but you can set a tone and manage a concept and get people behind it. So this last year, as an answer to some of the social needs, we talked about community schools as being an answer.
Great.
Building the village back to where it needs to be. So in my particular district, the city of Pasadena, we have started this partnership, or encouraged this partnership between the city and the school to take an elementary school and use it as a model. And it already had community involvement, but it's adding a health clinic on campus and trying to engage the nonprofits to assist this community at large. But it will be defined as to what the community needs. So we're starting this path, and we'll see where it ends up. But our community schools bus tour really lent itself in California that there are many individual districts, leaders in all over our state that are already doing this. And the state doesn't want to get in the way. We just want to make sure that we encourage this and allow it to bloom.
And this is a strategy that legislators in the other 49 states could do as well, because I think we could educate our legislators by taking them out for a study visit to see some of the great examples that we have all across the country. So you mentioned the issue in California, which is also an issue in the state of Connecticut, of the great wealth and poverty disparities. And I know, Mayor, that you have been really promoting this idea of addressing the opportunity gap that exists between the wealthier communities in Connecticut and the much lower income communities in the city that you govern. I'd love to hear you talk about how you're thinking about that opportunity gap and how you're addressing it in your community schools in Hartford.
First of all, I want to apologize if there's anyone here from Kentucky. Because I landed at the airport. I thought I was flying into Cincinnati. I thought I was flying into Cincinnati, and as soon as I got out of the plane, I was yakking away as to how excited I was that we're having a parade on Sunday, not realizing that I did not land in Cincinnati, that I had just landed in Kentucky. So I want to apologize and thank you for letting me arrive here unbruised and unharmed.
You might not get out now.
But getting to your question, I don't think that there's anywhere in the United States where the disparity is just so big. We have in the Hartford metro region the highest GPD in the world. And yet we have, particularly in the neighborhoods where we have our community schools, the poorest communities in the nation. I look at community schools as that great equalizer, or the potential for really being an equalizer, So in terms of looking at the community schools as places of opportunity and how that opportunity can take fruit to achieve a more just society, I look at different systems coming to play and merging in and around the community schools. For example, we've been addressing the issue of putting resources to bring down gun violence. In the last 3 years, 4 years, we've brought the number of shooting victims down by 40%. That is significant because a lot of our kids that are going to community schools do think about guns and gunfire as they're walking to school.
Yes.
And I think that no child, whether it's in this, especially in this country, right? Especially in the midst of the most affluent community in the nation, should have to think about being shot down on their way to school. When we think about opportunities in community schools, it draws our ability to look at our food systems and our food deserts and figure out ways as we develop the city to work with the communities, especially those communities where community schools are located, to resolve those issues. So when I'm looking the next step, because we've been into our process of trying to create schools of excellence now for several years, so we've learned about what things work and what things don't work as well, is to help and work with the community schools to create a much brighter but a much clearer vision for that community, so that when we look at community schools, we don't look at community schools as that school of default where kids that haven't been able to get into magnet schools or into charter schools are going to school. We look at community schools as places with a vision for the community that incorporates all the things that are important to those children, but more importantly to those families. I grew up in the South Bronx, and
Well, got a fan club over here.
and I think that it wasn't until our parents learned the connection between poverty and education and the role of the schools that many of us were able to succeed. So from a mayor's perspective, it's about inspiring. My predecessor and myself continuing the path of mayoral involvement. Mayors need to be involved. There's no way circumstances of life are going to change for the poor communities in our city unless we look at the strong relationship between education and opportunity and poverty and the lack of opportunity, and make sure that community schools are those dynamic places that this cataclysmic change can occur and occur very quickly, because we don't have 2, 3 more generations to risk in this process. I was talking with some people from my city, from my state, regarding one particular school that presents some challenges, and we don't have it right yet. We don't have it right yet. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But what I try to emphasize as I talk to people is that the communication, respect, and putting our best skills to work to come up with solutions with our partners is critical. And my apologies again to Kentucky, but thank you.
So I can see why the Hartford Community Schools Initiative received one of the Coalition's 2013 awards. Let's hear it for our Hartford friends. And it's because of the work of a lot of people, including the leaders of the city. I know in the work that I've been doing with your city, one of the issues that we've been discussing at the leadership level is how to get higher education more involved in the community schools. And I'm going to ask Ira Harkavy to give us his perspective, because Ira, of course, as we all know, has really been a leader within the higher ed institutions nationally on getting higher ed institutions more involved in K-12 education through the community school strategy as well as other strategies. So, Ira, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Jane. It's an enormous pleasure to be here and to see the extraordinary work that is going on. And it also is a wonderful panel. Besides seeing old friends like Jane, Kent and I used to hang on the higher ed front when he was Dean of Education at Temple.
I'm a recovering dean.
Right. He's a recovering dean. He was smarter than I. He moved on, but we worked together. And this is the first panel I've ever been on where not only is someone from the Bronx, because we both realized we were from the Bronx, but we went to the same high school together. Wow. And we have other, so this is an extraordinary opportunity for me. In all the years I've spoken, I never had the North Bronx, South Bronx together, and DeWitt Clinton High School, so it's a pleasure. So having, it's a coalition building. So let me touch on Jane's point about the role of higher ed, and first indicate that it resonates with the very themes that my colleagues talked about. So if we take 3 ideas, and then we'll talk about how to get higher eds involved, that my colleagues have expressed here, the issues of democracy, community, and the frightfully horrible disparities that undermine both of those aspects in American society. And I just want to touch on that briefly in higher ed and how to get them involved at a general level and then somewhat specifically. On the general level, the key issue is higher education, as well as education itself in this country, has as its primary purpose the purpose of a democratic society. From the founding of our common schools to the founding of our universities. Benjamin Franklin, who both founded Penn and was clearly a leader in this, said that the key aspect for the commonweal, for a good society, was not arms, was not wealth, but educating our youth up in virtue. Education, that's what mattered. And that was crucial to the whole development of what kind of society we want. So education centrally has that as a notion, and from the founding of colonial colleges and Penn's founding by Franklin, all schools, including land grants, everything but for-profits, have as their goal democracy. Have as their goal America realizing its democratic promise that's unfulfilled. That's the central idea. And higher education, Franklin indicated when we spoke about Penn, was to educate young people with an inclination joined with an ability to serve, inclination, moral, ability, intellectual, to serve mankind, human beings, one's country, friends, and family. So at its center is this idea of democracy. And when the issue of engaging higher education, it is crucial that it be called to its founding premises that it and the public schools are not realizing. The crucial issue is to, in fact, talk about the primary purposes, which is not to fulfill or commercialism, commodification, or just jobs. And that is the first issue, posing that. Right. The second component has to do with higher education as a core component of the schooling system. You cannot change K through 12 unless it's K through 20 plus. When William Rainey Harper, pre-K, I apologize, pre-K. You cannot change pre-K, pre-K. And when William Rainey Harper founded the University of Chicago, he emphasized that the purpose of education was the central role for universities. And certainly universities have moved far from that. But he said that universities, in spite of themselves, shape the entire schooling system. And the purpose of that was because they educate the teachers and the teacher's teacher. Every teacher is touched by that from every field, from social work to law to the fields of historians, which I am, to fields of medicine, to lawyers, to doctors, and most importantly, the teachers in the classroom. The teachers in the classroom. So the idea of a pre-K through 22, 3, 4, H plus is central. The component then about how this relates to community is higher education has to take on its role as the most powerful institution in every city and community, major city in the United States. We were talking about that in terms of the city of Hartford. And with Mayor Coleman, we talked about it with Minneapolis, St. Paul. The largest employers, the largest suppliers of real estate, the largest centers of culture who need to be involved in building community. Community is built face-to-face, not just generally. And face-to-face community, what John Dewey so strongly emphasized, is in fact crucial that institutions create those relationships and that they are rooted institutions. So one issue on higher education, I'll talk specifically for a moment, is to call them on that question as we call the public schools. To say that's your purpose, that's why you should get supported. And the support for higher ed should be by the proof of its activities, or as a term I've used, they need to be supported by the NOAA principle. Now, Kent and I did a lot of grants in our day. A lot of grants in our day, but the NOAA principle is different. You don't give universities money on spec, on promises. You do what Noah in the Bible. No more prizes for predicting rain, prizes only for building the arks, for producing social change. So that needs to be an issue that is pressed from local government on. And last thing I'll just say in terms of the work we've done is to engage universities as part of community school building as central as university-assisted community schools. And making this case not just on those issues, but you'll do better academics. Physicians will be better doctors by working at a school-based health clinic. We'll have lawyers become more compassionate in doing the law if they work with community on mediation. We'll have social workers become better providers of services and listening to communities by working in local schools. And we'll have our students, our undergraduates, become better citizens of America. And they'll be better citizens by connecting their academic work, their learning, to having young people learn physics at a university by teaching physics at an urban high school, where our chairman of physics does that. We have 60 faculty, from the chair of physics to the greatest sociolinguist in the world, devoting their academic work to improving their research, teaching, and learning by helping that school and its young children in that school learn better by active academic engagement. So the argument is general, but the argument is specific, and it's specific that every college and university will be a greater college and university if it focuses on university-assisted community schools and radically decreasing the horrible disparities in this country through active, engaged learning and community engagement with the school, the parents, and the wider community.
Thank you. Thanks. Don't you wish that Ira and Eva had been your history teachers? We've gotten 2 beautiful history lessons in the last 2 days, and I see you combine the skills of a preacher with the skills of a historian, and that's a beautiful thing. David, you've been very patient. It's nice to see you again. We're really so happy to have you on this panel, and so happy to have you in the White House. And we know that how important it is to have a veteran educator in the White House who's working on issues of for low-income children, and particularly boys of
all African American students.
All African American students.
And career entry.
Okay, great. And we know that you have had an opportunity to visit some community schools, I think most recently in Oakland.
Correct.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts about the relevance of this strategy to the work that you're doing and the work you care about.
Yeah, happy to answer that. First, let me say thank you to Marty, Lisa, and the leadership team for inviting me to participate in this conversation. The kindergarten teacher in me is acknowledging that lunch is always a difficult time, so I'm fighting the urge to ask you to stand up and shake the sillies out, but we'll keep going with it. And it's also hard to play cleanup after such remarkable comments, because not only do I have the thoughts that I started with, but now I want to respond to things they said as well. So I'll try and thread this all together in a way that makes sense. I encourage everyone to tweet as well. So when you asked the question initially, why community schools, I started in my head to think about the counterfactual. And I started with why not. So help me do this as an exercise. Raise your hand if you are an educator. Awesome. Raise your hand if within the last month you have felt overwhelmed at work. Right?
Go.
Hold on to that, right? And so I came into this room after having spent a couple of hours this morning at Schroeder High School, not too far from here, sitting with some young men who participate in a program called MORE that's about the cognitive, social, and emotional development of young men of color in particular. And what we acknowledge in that space is very similar to what you just demonstrated. Most young people, in particular the young people that Kent described in the slides that he shared, face challenges that would break the average adult before they show up at the schoolhouse door each day. Right? And so if we acknowledge a couple of axioms that are axioms because they're true, that one, it should not be the case that we expect educators singularly to solve all problems of all students. Two, that in addition to acknowledging that learning starts at birth and the preparation for learning starts well before birth, which is why we can't forget early learning, that a child's most important educator is his or her parent or guardian. As the mayor said, we simply cannot wait, right? We talk a lot about the crises narrative or the fact that it simply takes a village to solve this problem. If we think about all those things as being axioms are true, and we also hold on to the fact that the president frequently says, in America, when we talk about the democratic promise and the possibility of what it means to be successful here, it is sad that in our country, a child's opportunities are often predicted by their zip code or genetic code. We don't have any other reason but to embrace community schools, right? The point here is that this is an all hands on deck enterprise. There is not a caring adult who has the luxury of sitting this out, right? When we talk about what's required for our children, cognitively, socially, and emotionally, we all need to be invested. Simply put, and if we are ever going to move to a space where we can come together and have conversations about our students and our schools and it's not shrouded in predicting the rain or talking about the blight, then we have to engage the community and we have to do it authentically. And so something that I thought about when Ken started as well is I think there are spaces where certain members of the community are always invited into the schoolhouse, right? But the conversation that we need to have is what are we doing to ensure that everybody is welcome into that space? So that we're not simply talking about the value of community or identifying some to serve as proxies for the community, but we are literally finding ways to bring everybody into the schoolhouse because each of us has something to offer of value to our kids. And if we find ways to do that and get beyond what's often hard about being adults and dealing in silos and not wanting to talk to people who annoy you for sometimes valid reasons, we can just work better together. Right? And so again, I will conclude with this. When I was in Oakland with Lisa and some other colleagues, I had the chance to sit with some young men at Oakland High School who are part of the African American Male Initiative. There were another set of young brothers from Chabot College, Striving Black Brothers Initiative. These are young men who are often not seen nor heard. Right? When we think about the conversations that we have about young black men, the ones that the media perpetuates, the lies that people will have you believing, you don't hear their stories. And these are young men who are clear. I live in a community where I was woken up by gun violence today. Where on the walk to school, there were 10 people telling me why I should turn around and do something else. But I'm here because I see value in it. And we need to be held accountable. They want to be engaged. They want to know that people care about them and aren't just there for themselves. A young brother today talked about what it meant to see people who walk into that building wearing suits. And he said sometimes people put on suits and forget that it's not about what you wear, but it's where you came from or who you care about. The point I'm making here is that we don't have an opportunity to do anything but embrace the community. Literally embrace the community. Not just those that we like, not just those that also share our credentials, not just those that also understands Lucy Calkins and what a manipulative is, but the community, right? And until we do that in ways that are meaningful, are thoughtful, and are sustained over time, this can't be episodic. It can't be once a year you decide to bring in that part of the community and then you feel like you've done your job. Until we do that work, we can give up thinking that we'll ever transform the opportunity to move past this conversation.
I have the unfortunate job of having to be the timekeeper as well as the moderator, and we don't have a lot of time left because we do want to hear from Mayor Coleman, but I do want to give each of you a chance to talk to this wonderful group of 1,500 practitioners and advocates about what is the most powerful way to sell this concept and strategy to the leaders, your peers. And I'm going to start with you, Mayor Sagata. What do mayors need to hear from practitioners and advocates about why this is an important strategy? And let's try to do this very quickly, because I want to hear from everybody.
I'm interested in the dialogue, in the conversation,
Great.
in working together with all the stakeholders to form those solutions, those approaches. I'm a risk taker. You know, the whole issue, at one point was with elected boards of education, especially when they were partisans, and the politics that played out in that weren't necessarily conducive to the best educational models and systems. And we've gone through a process in my city where it says, okay, we'll hand it to the mayor, as if the mayor is not devoid of politics. We talk at the achievement gaps, but also voter participation and political participation in the communities in which we have our community schools is extremely low. So this is a perfect opportunity also to realign our communities to thinking that all these things are connected. And I want us to have a dialogue that's based about all the intersecting points, how community schools relate to producing the workers of the future, how community schools relate to how we're going to build our future housing stock or rebuild it, how it is connected to our health models and how we provide access to health and healthy foods. So I'm just looking to make sure that that conversation is continuous, because most of the times when we tried things and they didn't work out, it's because the communication broke down and then we just had to start from scratch and move over again. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Great. So advocates need to be continually talking to multiple stakeholders and leaders, right, and that there's an economic argument and a community well-being argument. I see David trying to get in.
Again,
please.
I bring into this space with me the young man who I spent time with this morning. We need to let the young people make the case. Yes. Adults talk too much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can tweet that. But no, I mean, to me, sometimes we make things more complicated than it needs to be. Let the youth make the case and continue to do the work. Allow them to talk about the value of having people come in and see the power of watching adults conspire for success. Right? What young person doesn't want to believe that every adult who's around is conspiring for their success? What would it mean if in every school, no matter what we called it or what it looked like, that was the reality? It would change this conversation in our country dramatically.
Great, thank you. Carol, do you want to weigh in? We're interested, all of us want to work with our state legislatures on this. So what's the message that state legislators need to hear?
Well, this is a really tough one. You know, as an individual person, you can only do so much to gain political well-being, to move an agenda forward, because you only have so many allies. But it's a compelling story what David talks about. If you talk to kids and have them come to you and say what is needed. I love, and you know, I love, Ira, your conversation about schools and the meaning of schools, the democratic process. We cannot forget the purpose of why we're here. And there's lots of hope in public education. And the communities that you are building, and we are all building together, is something that we just need to stick with it and keep moving it forward, keep moving that agenda forward. So, I mean, I just would not, there's going to be lots of barriers in the way, but I think it's something that we don't have an option of not seeing this successful.
Great, thank you. Ira, I'm going to come back to you last. Do you have anything you want to say to our assembled advocates about the message?
So I think in terms of the university side, which I referred to before, I'll just say two things. The first is you do have to always talk about the purpose of the work. And there's that wonderful quote from the great philosopher of science, Francis Bacon: you can't set a course aright unless the goal itself is rightly placed. The goal has to be clear. It has to be democracy. It has to be less disparities. It has to be fulfilling the promise, and that's what higher education's about. The second aspect is you have to build it. We have a network of university-assisted community schools that's growing all over the country, 2 regional centers, one in Indiana and one in Tulsa, and we have a third one every 4 years. We're able, because of an endowment, to develop this, but it's been growing separate from that. And the idea is it grows when people do the work together. You have to build it on the ground and ask people to come and visit. And then finally, to advance this work, you need a way of thinking about collaboration differently. A way about collaboration that involves government as a catalyst for change that builds partnerships. And that really involves seeing on the ground that the focus is not the individual, as Ken talks about, but the community. And that means that government from federal, state, and local and across those agencies works to create partnerships of universities, health and education, schools, unions, businesses, organizations in the community with higher eds and medical institutions part of it, working together through university-assisted community schools. And that means our discussions have to go to multiple departments in government, multiple levels of government, and in fact advocate for doing things differently based on the success we've had and the greatest success we would have if government and institutions made the building of community through university-assisted community schools as the central goal for realizing American democracy. That's what I think.
Great. Kent, what would you add to the message here? I know you've been thinking about the counter-narrative to privatization.
Right.
And so tell us in a couple of sentences what that counter-narrative, what's the core of that counter-narrative?
In a couple of sentences, right? Well, look, the point I was trying to make is that the dominant narrative has not been about community.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's been folks have succeeded in advancing a bad story about public schools.
Yeah, right.
And that's got to be replaced with the narrative. There's 1,500 people here. And, but a sense of agency and purpose in the education community and in communities generally, that's what needs to get lifted up, Jane. The evidence is on our side,
That's
by the way.
right. Well, and that may be a very important part of the message, right? That the evidence is on our side, and it's not on the side of a lot of the other parts of the narrative. They're great, right? Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very, very much. I think we should stay here because we're going to hear from Mayor Coleman, and I want to invite him to come up. I know he's been waiting in the wings, and so Mayor Coleman is the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, which is the home of the Achievement Plus Community Schools initiative. A lot of us are very familiar with that. And he is also the current president of the National League of Cities. So I think he has a few things to say about mayors and their leadership. So Mayor Coleman.
This is a great conversation, and I wish that I had been here yesterday and had an opportunity to spend a little bit more time with all of you, because the conversation, not just around community schools, but how we're going to change fundamentally educational outcomes to create that kind of democracy that Ira talks about, to create the fairness and the justice that David talks about, to do the work that we all know as leaders of our communities has to be done, and it has to be done rapidly, I think is the most important conversation that we can have. So I have to give two shout outs. First of all, I'm president of the National League of Cities this year, and we have done tremendous work, particularly through the Institute for Youth Education and Families, to really set the table for community leaders, particularly mayors and city council members, to have a role in education and to figure out what it is that they can do. And so I'm used to being in a group full of mayors that actually have that mindset, and I am stunned when I am with a mayor that doesn't have that mindset. Because if you're not having this conversation, then you're not talking about the future well-being of your community, plain and simple. You have to be engaged in the education conversation, and you have to take a lead role. But there's another phrase that mayors use a lot that don't control the school districts, as most of us do not. They say, well, I don't have a real role in education, or I don't control education. Well, that's maybe true if you're only thinking about education as something that happens inside the walls of a school. But the Mott Foundation told us a long time ago that education is something that happens all day, every day, 365 days a year. And when you think of education that way, there is no more important role than the role of the mayor, because the tools that we have at our disposals to create great educational systems and out-of-school time programs in our parks and in our libraries, the things that we can do to educate the people that interact with children, like our police officers, so that they understand how to interact with young kids that are in despair, that don't necessarily look like them or don't have their same background. To do real deep dives on racial equity work with all of your staff, as we've done in our city of St. Paul. You want to have an interesting conversation, have a bunch of cops sitting around talking about racial equity. It makes them really uncomfortable. But when they have that breakthrough moment, it is a really powerful thing to see because it changes how they approach their policing. And even in our Parks and Rec Center, we're opening up a new combined library and rec center in just a couple of weeks. But already the 60 staff workers that are going to be part of that community center have not only engaged with each other about how they're going to merge their staffs into kind of a seamless web of support for the children, but they did a 2-day standalone seminar or deep dive on racial equity work so that the minute the doors of that center open, they're dealing and they're addressing with some fundamental issues of disparities in our community. There are so many things that I think have been said that are profound up here. And I think Ken said the evidence is on our side. But it reminded me of a quote that I read this morning as I was on my way down here, and it was actually in the context of the correction system in New York and whether or not there was a proposal for providing college degrees for prison inmates. And there, of course, you know, any conversation about a good practice like that immediately gets thrown into politics and people go crazy. But there was a great quote from a person that had been working deeply in the correction system, and he said, there's almost a complete disconnect between what we know and what we do. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that exact same thing can be said about the education conversation. We know what to do. We know what has to be done. We know the resources that are required to fix this problem and these challenges that we face across our country, but we're not doing it. And we're not doing it because we don't embrace solutions like community schools, to have all of those resources brought together, to support our students and to support the families. And when we disconnect the things that we know affect an educational outcome, we're doing a disservice to our children. When we know that domestic violence in a household has a direct correlation between that student's success, then if we're not connecting those dots when we go into a home with an officer or a social worker and see domestic violence and figure out how to connect that to the conversation around school, then we have a disconnect. When we know that 10 or 20% of our students have a mental illness or a diagnosable but untreated mental illness, and we're not providing the resources and the support and the funding to deal with those mental illnesses that their children are suffering from, then we have a disconnect and we're not ultimately going to solve the challenges. And so we can point our fingers at teachers all we want. We can sit there and say it's your fault. But I think it's more important that we point our finger at the mirror and say, what is it that we're going to do to change outcomes for our children, and what role do all of us play in that conversation? We know that community schools work in the city of St. Paul, and we've seen it. And what's really interesting about it is we've seen not only how communities can change the schools, but how community schools can change the neighborhoods that they're in, and create a fundamental place where kids want to learn, where people thrive, where families feel like they're supported, where they know where to turn for help, whether it's an issue of a dental situation or mental illness or just a place where people are looking for a job, all of those things that can be housed under a community school's roof. When we connect those dots, we all of a sudden change outcomes for children. It is absolutely critical that we have strong leadership in our schools and that we have strong teachers. We've seen when that doesn't exist. We have 2 community schools, Dayton's Bluff and John A. Johnson. And for periods of time, the outcomes for those children have gone up and they've gone down. Though the path forward is fairly consistent and the increases in the students' achievement are fairly continuing to increase. But there have been times where the building leadership hasn't been as strong as it needed to be to really take advantage of the solutions that were in that school under the community schools model. And so it takes both sides of the equation. It takes strong schools, strong principals, strong building leaders, and it also takes the work of all of us in this community, in our communities, to make a difference for our children. There's a disconnect between what we know and what we do. Mm-hmm. And if we allow that disconnect to continue, then the results that we see, that we all are embarrassed by, in terms of achievement gaps, in terms of lack of preparation for college, lack of preparation for work, will continue in our country. And I don't think that we can afford to waste another generation of our children and to condemn them to poverty and despair and all the challenges that come with not being able to take their place in the 21st century workforce. Community schools, I think was said earlier, is not an answer, it is the answer. And when we work on that, we do right by the future of our communities. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.